The reading is taken from Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 to 16, the parable of the workers in the vineyard. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. He agreed to pay them a denarius for the day and sent them into his vineyard. About 9 in the morning he went out and saw others standing in the marketplace doing nothing. He told them, "You also go and work in my vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. He went out again at about noon and about 3 in the afternoon and did the same thing. About 5 in the afternoon he went out and found still others standing around. He asked them, "Why have you been standing here all day long doing nothing?" "Because no one has hired us," they answered. He said to them, "You also go and work in my vineyard." When the evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, "Call the workers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last ones hired and going to the first." The workers who were hired about 5 in the afternoon came and each received a denarius. So when those who were hired first came, they expected to receive more, but each one of them also received a denarius. When they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. "These who were hired last worked only 1 hour," they said, "and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of work and the heat of the day." But he answered one of them, "I'm not being unfair to you, friend. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give the one who was hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I'm generous?" So the last will be first, and the first will be last.
Thank you, Nikki and Sarah. I hate the game of Monopoly. It's what I would banish to Room 101 given the chance. In fact, my family have banned me from playing it because rather than seeking to get a Monopoly myself, I would spend the whole time trying to stop anyone else being able to by buying a spread of the roads and the utilities. Needless to say, they got quite frustrated with this, and that's why I ended up being banned. I hate the game so much that I even wrote a song about it, and hopefully one day when we can do concerts and things again, we can perform it for you. But for now, here's the chorus. From the old Kent Road to Mayfair, I just don't think you play fair. You collect the streets, build hotel fleets, and no one gets to share. I just don't think it's funny. You're making lots of money, but at my expense I take offence. It's just not fair. And that sums up what it is that I hate about the game. That whole principle of Monopoly, that one person gets all the wealth, but at the expense of the others. And the fact that as soon as one person starts to win, so their advantage grows really quickly. Whereas if you're not lucky early on, it's pretty hopeless that you'll ever catch up. In these strange times of lockdown, several people have commented on things that they're doing that they never thought they would do, and I've added a new one to my list this week, which is reading a book about economics, something I never imagined I'd do. It's a book that's called Donut Economics, which is quite a good title, isn't it? But what led me to start reading it was this passage that Steve shared with me, knowing my hatred of Monopoly. Kate Raworth, who's the author, writes, "Anyone who has played the board game Monopoly is well versed in the dynamics of what she calls success to the successful. Players who are lucky enough to land on expensive properties early in the game can buy them up, build hotels, and reap vast rents from their fellow players, thus accumulating a winning fortune as they bankrupt the rest. Fascinatingly, however, the game was originally called the Landlord's Game and was designed precisely to reveal the injustice arising out of such concentrated property ownership, not to celebrate it. The game's inventor, Elizabeth McGee, when she first created the game in 1903, gave it 2 very different sets of rules intended to be played in turn. One was the monopolist set of rules, which is what we would know, and another prosperity set of rules under which every player gained each time someone acquired a new property. And the game was won by all when the player who had started with the least doubled their money. The whole purpose of the dual set of rules was for players to experience a practical demonstration of the present system of land grabbing and so understand how different approaches to property ownership can lead to vastly different social outcomes. Ha, I like this woman, and perhaps this was a book worth reading. Well, I haven't read all of it, but Kate Raworth unpacks what she calls 7 myths of 20th century economic thinking, replacing them with 7 alternatives. And the reason that it's called donut economics is because she argues for a way to bring humanity into the sweet spot, the ring of the donut here. The inner ring represents social well-being, which if you fall beneath that and you go into the whole of the donut in the middle, is where people are deprived of the essentials they need, such as food and housing and shelter and education and health and all of those sorts of things. And the outer ring is the ecological ceiling, which if you go beyond that, then you're putting too much demand on the resources of the planet and you begin to cause damage and it's simply not sustainable. And so she argues for trying to keep the whole of humanity within the sweet spot where needs are met within the means of the planet. Kate has some really good academic credentials and the book has received great reviews and is causing quite a lot of discussion. It might be something that some of you want to take a look at. But how does all of this relate to our Bible readings for today? Well, the Old Testament reading from Deuteronomy is a clear example of how God called his chosen people, the Israelites, to live in a way that prevented monopoly and relieved poverty. Firstly, they were expected at all times to be generous to the poor and needy amongst them. Secondly, as we heard in today's passage, every 7 years they were told to cancel all debts, and that included releasing their slaves with some provision for them to be able to make a fresh start. That wouldn't bring about equality, but it would stop anyone getting trapped in poverty. And then thirdly, we read in Leviticus that the 50th year was to be the year of Jubilee, when land and property should be returned to the original owner or family. Everything was then evened up. There's a clear directive in Leviticus that the Israelites were not to accumulate land, but to recognise that it was God's and they were his tenants. So what does all this mean for us? It made me begin to wonder if we could live this way today. In the end, I think in a literal sense that the answer has to be no, because our context is so different and some of those rules just simply couldn't apply. But that doesn't mean that we can't take on board the principle of justice and compassion, preventing monopoly and protecting people from falling into the trap of poverty. Searching around the internet, I came across a useful article by a Jewish rabbi reflecting on the book of Leviticus and what it might say about our global economy today. Here's an extract from his summary. We learn from Leviticus that the planet is held as a trust from God and development is subject to the constraints needed to conserve the environment. It must be sustainable over the long term. Our common humanity under God demands that the rich nations assist the poor. International finance must be provided under favourable terms without the imposition of conditions and structures that hamper development. Periodically, debts may need rescheduling or even remission. And he then goes on, no system is perfect, and inevitably some will enrich themselves at the expense of others, and some will be placed under the domination of others. So from time to time, we must be ready to make the necessary adjustments to bring freedom to all, in joy, peace, and common humanity. Oh, there's so much to learn from the Old Testament reading and way of being. But then what about the gospel reading and those workers in the vineyard? I talked about monopoly being unfair. How many of you, I wonder, like me when I first heard that parable, thought, hang on, that's not fair. The workers who only worked for 1 hour got the same pay as those who'd worked all day? Yes. Let's unpack it some more. This parable is often known as the workers in the vineyard, but this commentator, Kenneth Bailey, suggests that it should be called the compassionate employer. In this book, Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes, he helpfully unpacks the parable from a Middle Eastern perspective, helping us to get a better picture of the context. And so he explains a scene which he has witnessed himself in the Middle East of a corner of the street market where unemployed men gather, hoping to be hired for casual work for the day. He writes that it's a fairly degrading, desperate place to be. It means that they haven't got regular work. The owner of the vineyard shows up and hires some of them to work for the equivalent of a living wage for the day. He then returns 4 more times through the day and on each occasion hires more men, not fixing a wage but saying that he will pay them fairly. There are several surprising things to note in this story. Firstly, with regard to the men. Why did they stand there all day in this humiliating situation and in the heat? Surely you might expect that they would give up by midday, certainly not stay there until an hour before sunset. It seems they were determined to do all they could to get what they could. They were doing their best against the odds. And then there's the owner. It's very surprising that he went himself to hire the men and didn't send his manager. And why does he keep coming and going all day? Surely he knows how many workers he needs in his vineyard. Why didn't he just hire the right number at the start? Well, given that he is going himself, and knowing about his generosity at the end of the day, I think we can conclude that he was acting not out of his own necessity, but out of compassion for the unemployed. And his compassion continues when it comes to their wages. He was operating on a different economic system to his day, a system of justice. No one was underpaid. They got the decent living wage that had been agreed. But a system that also had room for compassion, generosity, and grace. Outrageous grace. It certainly enraged the first workers, and me too, in my initial reaction of, well, that isn't fair. But then it makes you stop and think, what is fair? Pay matched to productivity, which, if we're honest, doesn't only depend on the effort you put in, but also on inherent capability and the opportunities that have come your way in life. Or a measure of fair pay for everyone doing their best, such that everyone has enough to feed their family. That was the dignity that the vineyard owner afforded to all of his workers, a fair wage and the dignity of employment. It brings us back again to the difference between the monopoly rules, where the fortunate can quickly build on their success while others fail, and the prosperity rule, where all players win together once the poorest has seen success. This theme of valuing life and these Bible passages have sent me on a long journey this week of reading and reflecting and praying, and I find myself left with lots of challenging questions. What does it mean for us in trying to build back to a better world? And how do we apply principles of justice and compassion in reality when it comes to our global economics and to our own finances and decisions about church funds? Isn't it actually all rather idealistic and impossible to live out in practice? Well, perhaps, but I hope not. And I don't think that we should give up on the questions. As Lucer said in his talk last week, questions are an uncomfortable place to be. We feel out of control, the future feels uncertain, and we can be very tempted to try and jump to quick answers. But I think it's important that we stay with the questions, ponder them together, pray and keep praying, in the hope that God's hand will be seen in the answers as they begin to emerge. Now, I've talked a lot about valuing life and how that might apply to our economic decisions and our relationships with one another. But I think there is one final and further point, one that perhaps surely should be the starting point, and that maybe offers a greater challenge to many others. And that is to consider how we apply this principle of valuing life to ourselves. Do we allow that our life has value apart from our productivity? It's not based on the things we have or do, our capabilities, our skills, our achievements in life. With outrageous grace, God loves each and every one of us as his beloved children. Beloved not because of anything we've done, in fact, loved very often despite things that we have done. Loved just because. And I think that has to be the starting point from which we begin to tackle those other questions. And some of that is expressed in the words of our next song, which I invite you to listen to and to reflect. My worth is not in what I own.